In the small town of Willow Creek, Saturday mornings had a rhythm of their own. The air smelled faintly of fresh bread from the bakery down the street. The coffee shop buzzed with regulars catching up on gossip, and the little hardware store at the corner of Maple and 3rd stood with its sliding glass doors, welcoming in locals with projects big and small. Jake Turner pushed those doors open just like he did every week. His worn flannel shirt hung loose over faded jeans, and his steel-toe boots carried the scratches and scuffs of years of hard work. His 8-year-old daughter, Emily, trailed behind, clutching her ragged teddy bear in one arm and a small bag of jelly beans in the other. Jake wasn't there for fun. He had a mission, one he wasn't even sure was possible. 2 weeks earlier, a summer storm had rattled the whole neighborhood. Wind howled, branches snapped, and in the chaos, his elderly neighbor, Mrs. Hanley, had watched in horror as her family's 90-year-old grandfather clock toppled over. The wood split in 2 places, the pendulum bent, and the inner gears jammed like a rusted lock. The repair shop in the next town quoted her over $3,000 to fix it, money she didn't have. Jake had simply said, "I'll give it a try." He wasn't a professional clockmaker. He was a mechanic by trade, but he had a steady hand, endless patience, and a belief that almost anything could be fixed if you cared enough. That belief had gotten him through plenty of tough repairs before. Still, a 19th century clock was a different beast entirely. Now, standing in aisle 3 of the hardware store, Jake examined the rows of tools. He didn't go for shiny, expensive ones. Instead, he reached for the familiar, the scratch screwdriver that fit his grip perfectly, the sandpaper he'd used on a dozen furniture projects, and a simple measuring tape that had survived a decade of abuse. Seriously? The voice was light, but there was an edge of disbelief. Jake turned to see a woman he didn't recognize, tall, stylish, wearing designer boots that had never seen mud. She carried herself like someone used to being listened to. She looked at the items in his basket and raised a perfectly shaped eyebrow. "You're going to fix something with those?" Jake kept his tone even. "That's the plan." Her lips curved in an amused smile. "What is it? A leaky chair, a loose cabinet hinge?" "A 90-year-old grandfather clock," Jake said, meeting her eyes. The woman actually laughed. Not cruelly, but enough to make her disbelief obvious. "With those tools? Where I'm from, that's the kind of job you hand over to a specialist with a shop full of precision instruments. Not whatever that is." She gestured to his basket. Jake didn't flinch. "Sometimes the job's more about the hands holding the tools than the tools themselves." She tilted her head as if she wanted to respond, but instead she smirked and turned away, disappearing down the next aisle. "Emily!" frowned up at her dad. "Why was that lady laughing at your stuff?" Jake gave a small smile. "Because some people think the only way to do something right is with fancy things. But you know what I think?" "What?" Emily asked. "It's not about what you have. It's about what you know how to do." They left the store and drove home, the August sun spilling gold over the quiet streets. Jake's garage wasn't fancy, just a space cleared between stacked boxes and an old workbench he'd built himself. He laid the clock parts out carefully, like a surgeon prepping for an operation. The wood was in worse shape than he'd thought. Deep cracks ran through the frame. The ornate carvings on the sides had splintered, and the gears inside were frozen with rust. Jake took a breath. "All right, old friend, let's see what we can do." Over the next week, his garage became a workshop of determination. He worked late into the night, Emily sometimes sitting nearby, coloring or handing him tools. The sound of sandpaper on wood mixed with the faint clink of metal gears. Each day brought new problems. The pendulum's rod was bent at an angle that threatened to snap. The smallest gear teeth were worn down, meaning they'd need to be rebuilt by hand. Jake didn't have a lathe, so he improvised, reshaping them with a file under a magnifying lens. He glued and clamped the wood frame, waiting patiently for each joint to set before moving to the next. When the shape held, he sanded until the surface was smooth as glass, then stained it to match the deep walnut of the original finish. By the 7th night, the pieces came together. Jake stood back as the brass pendulum swung for the first time in years, the steady tick-tock, tick-tock filling the air. When he carried the finished clock into Mrs. Hanley's living room, her eyes went wide. She ran her fingers over the smooth wood, then looked at him, voice trembling. Jake. It's like it was never broken. She wasn't the only one to witness it. Claire Matthews, the woman from the hardware store, stood in the doorway, holding a box of curtains Mrs. Hanley had ordered from her interior design business. She froze when she saw the clock. "You fixed that?" she asked, the disbelief clear in her tone. Jake wiped his hands on a rag. "With the same tools you laughed at." For once, Claire had no quick comeback. She just stared at the clock and then at him, like she was seeing both for the first time. 3 days after the grandfather clock's return to Mrs. Hanley's living room, Jake was back in his garage, tinkering with Emily's old bicycle. It was a quiet evening, the kind where you could hear the crickets outside, when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. He almost didn't answer, but something made him swipe the screen. "Mr. Turner?" The voice was familiar. "This is Claire Matthews." Jake leaned against the workbench. "Didn't expect a call from you. I do need your help, and before you say no, hear me out. It's urgent." Her tone wasn't the same confident, teasing one from the hardware store. It was strained. Half an hour later, Jake's pickup rolled to a stop in front of Claire's renovated farmhouse. Inside, the place was chaos. Sheets of drop cloth covered the floors, boxes of decor were stacked against the walls, and in the center of the dining room stood a massive reclaimed wood table, or rather half of one. A jagged crack split the table right down the middle, as if it had been struck by lightning. The split ran deep, and the edges didn't align cleanly. "That was my centerpiece," Claire said, pacing. "It's supposed to be the highlight of my upcoming design showcase, the thing everyone talks about. The event is in less than 48 hours. I called 3 restoration companies. They all said it can't be done in time." Jake studied the table, running his hand over the rough, torn grain. "I can do it." Claire blinked. "You're serious? That table is worth more than my car. If you ruin it, then it was already ruined," Jake said simply, his voice steady. "But I don't think that's going to happen." She hesitated, chewing her lip. "And you're going to fix it with—" Jake gave a faint grin. "The same old tools you didn't believe in." Without another word, he went to work. The next 12 hours were a blur of focus. Jake clamped the split edges, gently forcing them into alignment. He used wood glue in measured amounts, letting it seep deep into the crack. While it cured, he began working on the smaller gaps, filling them with a custom blend of sawdust and glue that would later blend perfectly into the grain. Claire hovered at first, watching every move like a hawk. But as the night wore on, her suspicion shifted to quiet curiosity. She found herself handing him clamps, fetching sandpaper, and even holding a flashlight when he needed more light. Between the sanding and the staining, there were moments of silence. Not uncomfortable, just steady. Claire finally spoke. "You really believe anything can be fixed, don't you?" Jake kept his eyes on the wood. "Most things, sometimes it's not about making it perfect again. Sometimes it's about making it strong enough to last." By dawn, the table's surface was seamless. The crack had vanished, replaced by a smooth, unbroken grain that looked like it had always been there. Jake ran his palm over it one last time, then stepped back. Claire approached slowly, her hand hovering over the surface before she touched it. I don't understand. It looks like nothing ever happened." Jake shrugged. "It happened. You just can't see it anymore." She looked at him then, something softer in her expression. "I owe you more than I can say." 2 nights later, the design showcase buzzed with guests. Local business owners, art lovers, even a few journalists from the city. The table stood in the center of the main room, bathed in warm light. People circled it, admiring the craftsmanship, running their fingers over the flawless finish. "This piece is stunning," one woman said to Claire. "Where did you find it?" Claire smiled, glancing toward the door. "It was a gift in a way. Outside, Jake sat in his truck, leaning against the driver's side door. He wasn't much for crowds, so he'd planned to drop by later after things quieted down. But before he could leave, Claire appeared, holding 2 cups of coffee. "You weren't going to come in?" she asked. "Didn't think I'd fit in with all the fancy people," Jake said, taking the cup she offered. She laughed, not the mocking laugh from the hardware store, but a warm, genuine sound. "You're the reason my showcase even happened. The least you can do is take a bow." Jake shook his head. "The table speaks for itself." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, sipping coffee under the glow of the streetlight. "You know," Claire said, "I think I misjudged you and your tools." Jake smirked. "Guess they're not so funny now." "No," she said softly. "They're kind of legendary." Something in her tone told him she meant more than just the tools. As she headed back inside, Jake watched her go, a faint smile tugging at his lips. Maybe life in Willow Creek had just gotten a little more interesting. And somewhere deep down, Claire knew that sometimes the right hands could turn even the impossible into something unforgettable.